a treatment which has become quite well known over recent years, partly because of a book that I wrote about 5 years ago called The Lightning Process. Again, is something that works at certain stages, and maybe it's worth, again, just briefly talking about that.
Exactly that. And I think it's almost quite similar. I think where, by and large, what's happening is the system's burnt out, but actually it's really just the maladaptive stress response that's keeping everything locked in. And actually, apart from that, nothing too much is wrong physically. Then the lightning process is basically breaking the fear patterns that people can develop around moving on and around being able to get their lives back. That can be great, perfect for certain people who are at certain points. My issue with it, I think, generally is a couple of things. And of course, we see a lot of people who've gone through it and it hasn't worked or it's made them worse, and that's going to make kind of colour how we see things. I think for people who really aren't at that stage and it's the car with no petrol, they push, but often that was what got them to the point where they got in the first place. So pushing is really not the answer and will often send them straight back where they got to. Sometimes also they can then feel like it's their fault. They did something wrong. And that's a problem too, because it's not about that. It's about having an overall understanding of what's happening physically, emotionally, psychologically. The other issue I have with it is that it doesn't necessarily address what's gone on emotionally or teach people to listen to themselves. And as we said, that can be a massive factor for some people. So if all it's doing is encouraging you to push through what's there, that for a lot of people is not going to be ultimately very sustainable. Not for all, but as I say, it's different individuals and different stages. So, yeah. So
you're saying that some of the ideas and tools in there can be helpful,
definitely,
but in a more integrated kind of format of using it.
That would be my view, that in a way it's dealing with, again, one facet of ME without seeing the whole picture. And you really have to see the whole picture, I think, yeah.
And another treatment approach, which also has had a lot of press a few years ago, something called reverse therapy. And again, maybe it's explaining briefly what that is and some of your thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, again, I mean, reverse therapy, we've talked about kind of the body and the intelligence of the body and the idea that there's an emotional intelligence and a real fundamental wisdom there. And I think that's very true, and it was a significant part of what I understood in my own process of getting well. Reverse therapy really is working on the principle that all of our symptoms are based on our failure to respond to something emotionally in the environment at that point in time. So as we begin to learn to understand what's happening emotionally in ourselves, we gain emotional intelligence and learn to listen to ourselves better, we can act on those things, and then the body won't need to give us symptoms. Again, a really good concept, and I think in some ways really useful, but I also think limited. Again, I would say there are two factors that I think limit that. Three, maybe. The first is it doesn't take into account any of the physical side of things. Same with the lightning process. You know, for some people, they really need to do some detox work and some mitochondrial and adrenal work to improve things. And being told that that's completely irrelevant is not always helpful. The other two issues that I think are there with it is the first, that very often people who get to the point of being kind of crashed out and burnt out with ME or CFS tend to be quite in their head and quite in that stress anxiety state. And for a lot of people, if you tell them that what they need to do is to listen to their body and understand the message and then things will improve, they get very anxious about that. So it becomes another source of stress. And unless you know how to do that, unless you've been taught how to do that, really understand how to listen to yourself, that's not an easy process. I know for myself it took a while, and with patients it's a bit of a process as opposed to an overnight thing. So I think it simplifies things, again, a little too much. It doesn't take into account the role of the mind and the stress state in the illness, and it doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that it's not always that easy to just instantaneously pick up on what's happening in your inner wisdom. That can take a while. It's
interesting because we kind of talked at the start about it's not just psychology or just nutrition or just the physical structural side, but you're also saying even within the psychology side of it, there's different approaches that have different bits of the picture. I know a lot of people with ME do things like yoga and meditation and find that really helpful as part of their recovery, but maybe it's helpful but not a whole answer. Maybe talking briefly around that as well.
I'm a big fan of both. I think that if we talk about everything we're talking about, being in touch with your body and getting into a healing state, learning how to understand and listen to yourself differently, both meditation and yoga both facilitate that. So fantastic, fantastic tools. But I know that if I use me as an example, I got to the point when I was trying to get better of meditating for like 4 to 6 hours a day. And it came to the point where I realised that as long as I was in meditation, I would be fine. But as soon as I hit the real world, things were not going as well. So I think the problem is that meditation takes you to a good state, as does yoga. And over time, it also teaches you to be there more. But it doesn't necessarily deal with the underlying stress factors or, I guess, stress patterns that are there and emotional patterns that are there in our relationship to the world around us. So it's, again, part of the picture and a good part of the picture, but you often need to understand what's happening logically and emotionally a little more as well, to be able to turn that around. Otherwise, you could end up meditating for all your life and not actually living.
Okay, because I mean, we talked about quite a lot of different approaches, different ideas, the mind, the body, the emotions.
Yeah.
Maybe at this point we could kind of break it down to some of the key things that need to shift with the psychology side of it for them to be able to recover from ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the first key thing is that very often, as we've said, we're in a stress state when we have this state of ME. And that is usually a combination of factors, but a significant proportion of that is to do with the fear that's basically there around the illness. That's completely logical, by the way. It's completely logical that if you've gone through something quite horrible, you're going to want to avoid doing it again. So we start to limit or get scared of the world around us, be it foods that could make us ill or doing things that could make us ill. And of course, that perpetuates the stress state. We mentioned that already. So the first thing to do really is to begin to learn and to unlearn the patterns that we've learnt of stress and fear that usually are going on in fairly significant proportions. So it's dealing with some of the anxiety. Very often also it's useful to say that that isn't just about the illness. There are usually anxiety patterns that pretty much predated that.
So you're talking about there's the psychology side prior to ME, and there's the psychology side resulting from someone having the illness.
Exactly that. And in a way, very often what the illness does is feed the anxiety or psychology that was there before we got ill. So if we were a worrier anyway, suddenly we have a lot to worry about, and it really can feed into the same patterns. So that's one of the key things to begin to work with and begin to resolve, because whilst that's there, it's almost blocking everything else being able to improve, if that makes sense.
As we were saying earlier, you're saying people are in almost exactly the opposite state to what they need to be in to be able to heal. There's a state of stress, a state of healing, and they're in a state of stress.
And actually we have more control over what's happening in our bodies physically than we might know through working with the psychology and the psychology patterns. And I know that can be challenging as well, because it feels like it's just happening to us. But of course, that's the scary thing, right? That we have no control over it and it's just these random symptoms happening. When you begin to understand the real links between what happens in your mind and your thoughts and your emotions and what happens physically, there are very strong correlations. I was saying to a patient the other day, it's not random. It feels random, but it's a bit like a cake, if you put certain things into a cake, you're going to get the same cake out every time. And actually, the more that we begin to understand and really be clear about what's happening in our psychology and our emotions, the more we begin to understand how we're getting the results that we're getting. Now, again, that doesn't mean, because people then come back and go, oh, so maybe it is all in my mind. No, it's because there is a real physiological, chemical response that happens in the system.